Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the show, my name is Irina Zuckerman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have a special guest, Dr. Ian Garner. He's a historian and analyst of Russian culture and war propaganda. He's also an author of two books. The first one was Is Stalingrad Lives? Stories of Combat and Survival. And the second one coming up in the spring is Z Generation, Into the Heart of Russia's Fascist Youth. And actually we'll be addressing both, addressing how Russia transitioned to where it is today from its historic roots to this contemporary movement that echoes some of the enemies it claimed to be fighting previously. But before we get into this substantive discussion of Dr. Garner's research, if you could please tell us a little bit about yourself, about your professional background and your interest and involvement in this area.
So firstly, thank you for having me. Good evening, everybody. My name is Ian Garner, and I guess my professional background it took a long and winding road to get me from suburban London growing up as a boy through studying in Russia. I studied at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. I lived in Russia, and then I spent a long time teaching English to Russian children in southern Finland, which was a favored destination of middle-class parents back in the 2000s and the early 2010s. And then I came to Canada to do a PhD. I researched the Battle of Stalingrad extensively, and then moved on to this newer research project on Russia's youth. And I guess what motivates me in terms of research and in terms of understanding Russia is understanding the Russian mindset, not as a kind of some spiritual, mystical idea of Russkaya dusha, the Russian soul. But what can we do to understand what makes Russians tick? Historically, behind closed doors, when we think of the Soviet Union, those sort of kitchen table conversations, what is it that drives people towards patriotism? And today, what is it potentially that might be driving the wave of rhetorical and physical violence that we're seeing unfold within Russia and, of course, in Ukraine today?
How did your personal experiences inform your historical and more contemporary studies? Or was there any connection between you observed and anything that you uncovered in your academic research?
So I think one of the starting points I had way back when, this is over a decade now ago, was thinking about, well, we have war myths in the West, and we are obsessed with war. War dominates all societies. And, you know, you think of any country's greatest stories of itself, it tends to be born of war, the American War of Independence. And the Second World War, of course, looms large in Western culture, right? You know, we can think about D-Day, we can think about the idea of the Blitz spirit. But what really interests me is how these stories are used in the present to justify and explain the world today. And that's really where you start to see Russia diverge in a major way from the way that we understand the war. And it can be summed up, especially with regards to the Second World War, which is the dominant war in Russian culture, with this idea of, you know, when we in the West think about war, typically we think about never again. We regret war. We wish it didn't have to happen. We're not necessarily proud of the fact that the war existed. We're proud potentially of soldiers and sacrifices that are made, but we wish that we could have had zero deaths on all sides, right? That's how war works. And yet in Russia, there is this perverse pride in trumpeting the amount of deaths, as if, and this is really what I get into in the Stalingrad book, as if the idea of sacrifice is necessary. It is desirable to see death in war. It is desirable to sacrifice young men and women in a destructive war that somehow saves Russia and the world.
What you're saying reminds me of something that I learned about Chinese culture, where the results of hard work is almost not as relevant as the actual sacrifice of putting in the hard work. So even if you can become more efficient at your work and not have to work as hard to get better results, that will not necessarily be as praiseworthy as the sweat and the sleepless nights put into the optics of working hard. So this perception of sacrifice, some people claim that it is rooted in Russian history, in Russian culture, in the history of various invasions, going all the way back to the Tatar Mongol invasion. And you can see, for instance, the religious undertones of sacrifice as a good in itself in Dostoevsky's literature, which has, you know, brought many Western minds to this idea of Russian soul and Russian culture and this whole concept. What do you think about that? Do you think this particular ideation is something that was made up by the Soviet authorities to justify the ineptitude? Or do you think there is some sort of a longer historical reasoning for this gravitation towards the idea of sacrifice and suffering as something that is somehow beneficial and cathartic?
Well, I think to a certain extent, both. The argument for pragmatism is very strong, especially when you look back at the Second World War, where there were just devastating errors, error after error made, almost deliberately, almost out of stubbornness by the Soviet leadership, in particular by Stalin, who took such an active role in making decisions about the way that the war was going to be fought on the Eastern Front. So creating this myth that, you know, especially when it comes to Stalingrad, we had to send 1 million men into the city to die in order to save the world. This was all part of Stalin's great strategic sort of master plan. Well, that's very convenient, isn't it? And certainly you see echoes of that story today. We constantly see dripping through the culture today the idea that things might be going badly right now at the front for Russia, but this is all part of the plan. Don't worry, trust the leadership. Remember World War II, remember 1941, and then remember Stalingrad. Look how well things turned out, right? So there is that pragmatic element, but certainly the idea goes back. It's much more deeply ingrained in Russian culture. It didn't have to be that way, but it's been cultivated by numerous regimes and numerous actors, nationalist groups in particular. And you can trace it all the way back, almost 1,000 years ago. You look at the very first medieval epics that we have, the lay of Igor's campaign, Zadonshchina, which is another, you know, the listeners probably won't know, but these are age-old texts. Many of them are about tragic defeats that somehow make Russia more holy. And then you can chart it through the 15th century, this idea of Moscow as Third Rome, which is the idea that after Constantinople had fallen to the Byzantine, the Muslim empire, Russia was the only remaining true Christian power because, of course, out in the west of Europe, the Catholics were heathens. And so it was Russia's responsibility to fight, to defend itself, to defend the Orthodox, that is, the civilized world.
This idea of sacrifice and suffering as cathartic, as redeeming, it speaks to a lot of Christians in the West who are not familiar with, first of all, historic persecution of various Christian groups, and second, with the fact that a lot of this has been a reactive response to failing to achieve their own geopolitical goals and failing to emerge victorious in battle. Quite frankly, this is a rhetoric of losers who have historically lost battle and had to explain why they lost to their populations, and attaching religious redemption to values, to suffering resulting from lost battles seems to be like a good way of combining these two ideas even very early on. But to the Western mind, this seems to be kind of very much in line with this idea of martyrdom and suffering for a higher religious goal. And that is part of the reason why Putin Putin's rhetoric in recent years was very much geared towards cultivating a level of sympathy among conservative Christians in the West. How is that, in your research, has that theme been, did you notice recognition of that theme among the field of research that you encountered, or is it something that has fallen by the wayside, in your opinion?
You mean the specific links with Christianity itself?
Yes, this idea of redemptive value of suffering, that kind
No,
of.
absolutely. This is something that's being deeply ingrained in Russian culture today. The Putin regime there is a scholar from, I think, Princeton, maybe Yale, one of the good ones, Sergei Ushakin, who wrote a fabulous book in the 2000s about the sort of the post-Soviet identity of the Russian community, and described World War II as, when everything else was falling apart, the war was Russia's only remaining sacrality. It was the only thing holy they had left. And today, of course, we've seen that taken and turned into a kind of a state religion, really, where we have temples, war memorials, monuments that function just like Orthodox icons might have functioned today, might have functioned in the past during periods of war. We have today, in this really sort of corrupted and, of course, blasphemous way, if you're an Orthodox believer, if you're a Christian, we have the portraits of young soldiers going up on billboards around Russian cities, being turned into sort of saintly icons. These people died for you. They've had a leg blown off for you. They've gone to fight for you. Therefore, we're almost literally elevating them into this pantheon of saints and saying, this is the way to be. And that is the message increasingly as the state is changing school syllabuses. And this is what I talk about extensively in the Z Generation book. The state changes school syllabuses today, and it's changing them faster than it ever has done before, to teach young children that joining the army, potentially sacrificing yourself, certainly giving up your individual goals for the greater good, is what makes you a good person, is what makes you a good citizen and a good community member. And of course, right now, the state is creating communal goals, wider goals within Russia that are linked to aggression and violence and the constant stamping out of the other, whatever the other is. Right now, it's Ukrainians, but in the past, it's been homosexuals, it's been Chechens, and who knows who it could be next.
You noted quite correctly that the sheer number of total sacrifices in World War II and deliberate sacrifices even is humongous, in the millions. Why then did you decide to focus specifically on Stalingrad?
So Stalingrad's really interesting because, coming back to a point you made a couple of minutes ago about they're always trying to sell losing in war and disaster in war. Well, Stalingrad, in one sense, is a disaster. 1 million people die. There is a humanitarian disaster. And yet Stalingrad is undoubtedly a miraculous and triumphant military victory at the same time. Now, military strategists and military historians will tell you it might have been won in a different way that would have been less harmful. And yet the fact of the matter is, it is very rare in military history where you can pinpoint a turning point in a vast conflict like World War II down to almost a week or a day, as was the case in Stalingrad, where, to give you a very brief history of the battle, in late 1941, the Soviets had beaten the Germans outside of Moscow. That was the end of the initial onslaught. Things went quiet for a few months. The following summer, the Germans launched a massive attack down through the south and east of Russia, aiming, and of course through the associated territories in the Soviet Union, aiming to get down to the oil fields in the Caucasus, cut off the Soviets' oil supply. Bingo, you've won the war. At least that was the plan. Now, Stalingrad was a city on the Volga, this major river that basically stood between the German forces and this goal. There was some intense and bloody street fighting that went on for about 3 months, and the conflict extended for really hundreds of kilometers along the front, along the Volga River and around it. And it genuinely looked like the Soviets were going to lose, that they would fold at Stalingrad and the unthinkable might happen. And what's interesting at Stalingrad is that we see a genuine sense of a unity of purpose amongst the people who were there, the writers who covered the battle, the soldiers who were in the battle, almost regardless of their attitude to Stalinism, to the Soviet Union as a whole. They recognized that this was the battle they had to win to stop the real German genocide that was taking place against Jews, against minorities, and in particular against Slavs in general. And then in mid-November, November the 19th, Stalin and his generals, Zhukov is the famous one, masterminded this counterattack. It was a real gamble. They launched the counterattack, encircled the German army, and that was basically it. That was the end of Hitler's ability to win on the Eastern Front. And so instead of a battle that is a battle about trying to sell a losing cause, you're trying to sell this battle in which, as always happens in myths and as always happens in resurrection stories, thinking of the Christian story, we turn from death to life as Jesus dies and is resurrected. We have a battle where it almost happens historically. And that makes it a really interesting case for understanding how this kind of myth can be sold to the public, and therefore how you can cover up the errors that led to 1 million people dying, and how you can amp up the population today by saying any amount of sacrifice can be justified because things might just turn on a dime and we will go from certain death to the possibility of life anew.
So this mythology of Stalingrad has been like historical. It's been sold for several generations now. And it kind of took on a life on its own, even for people today who are obviously were not alive back then and have only heard about it through history books. And while we can say that the curriculum currently is being changed to become obviously even more mythological than it was previously, I can't say that the Western curriculum has not similarly reflected this myth as well. In fact, a lot of the Soviet propaganda is very much part of the Western description of this very strange alliance between the Allies during the war and against Hitler. Much the destructive and chaotic tendencies of the Stalinist regime have been significantly underplayed. Do you think this Western reluctance to confront that harsh reality of historical alliance of convenience, do you think it strengthens the propaganda of first the Soviet and then the Russian state by not confronting that myth at some point in time? Has the West enabled this disinformation effort?
I mean, yes, and the time to confront it would have been in the 1990s, when really almost all of the reconstruction efforts, the post-Soviet efforts that we made from a Western perspective within Russia were about economics. The idea that somehow Russia's economic growth would drag the country into holding a more liberal opinion about history, being open to reassessing the Stalinist past and some of these myths. And therefore, when Putin strolled through the doors of the presidential palace at the end of 1999, he didn't have to reconstruct these myths. He had to simply take things that had gone unchallenged for 10 years, for several decades. And in the 1990s, although there was an explosion of interest in alternate narratives about the Soviet past in general, there wasn't really much unpicking of what happened during World War II. That was the period that really was left untouched, as if it were this sort of holy object. And I think that's led us into a dead end today, where the Russian state is able to portray all of its wars as being a repetition of World War II. This idea of "можем повторить," we can do it again. Not this never again we have in the West, but we're fighting in Chechnya, we're fighting in Georgia, we're fighting in Ukraine in 2014, again we're fighting in 2022. All of these things can be attached onto this myth, and it's hard for people to read war and read sacrifice in different ways as a result.
I want to also underscore a different point arising from the same concept, which is this also might be making it more difficult for NATO allies to understand each other, because the Baltic states and Poland have had quite a different experience from UK, France, and others, and certainly the United States in that regard. And their narrative has always been quite distinct. They regarded the Soviet Empire exactly as equally evil as the Nazi era, and they were occupied and victimized by those events. How has that distinction in visions of the role of the Soviet state, and certainly in the educational system, has it played into the differences in the approach to modern day Russia policy?
Well, I think so. There is simply a lack of understanding in the Western leaderships. Generally, I mean, there are some notable exceptions. There are some people who are wise to this stuff and who are very interested in it. And I think over the last year, we've seen a general move in Western policymaking communities to be more open to this sort of interdisciplinary work and this sort of understanding of mindsets and history and the way that it plays into the conflict today. But the problem fundamentally we have is that the Russian state is so attached to living in this sort of mythical reality, and it's created a propaganda world in which people can live in this sort of mythical reality in which time is not linear. And I think that is, if you want to get really abstract and philosophical about it, that is the difference between the post-Soviet paths of Russia and, for example, the Baltic states. The Baltic states, and increasingly Ukraine, are trying to move into a world in which the past belongs to the past, trying to move into a world in which the present and behavior in the present is dictated by international norms, by international laws, and so on and so forth. Whereas the Russian state and a huge section of the Russian public, whether they support the Ukraine war explicitly or not, is content to live in this sort of quasi-religious world. And of course, the Russian state is giving the public a big push in this regard. This quasi-religious world in which we're constantly grasping to recreate the victories of the past, whether that's an imagined victory of the Tsarist era in which Russia was great, whether it's recreating a rose-tinted version of the Soviet Union, or whether it's fighting Stalingrad again or fighting the war again in some way. And the problem we have is that when you're coming from the different sides, from the Russian perspective and the Western perspective, and I would include the Baltic states and Ukraine in that perspective, it is very hard to talk about the past and the future, rationality and logic, when there is this simple divide in the understanding of those terms between the two sides.
There's been a lot of recent discussions about how to engage non-Western countries, the so-called Global South and the Middle East, into the anti-Russian pro-Ukraine alliance. One of the discussions points has been the wrong strategy by NATO, just basically threatening sanctions, not taking national interests of those countries into considerations, all very valid points that I full-heartedly support. But what you're bringing up is something different, which is this historical approach, the non-linear time and quasi-religious aspect of the Russian mythology that may be more appealing to some of these countries which operate very much the same era, the same way. Tribal societies that are driven at least in part by religions and by ancient feuds among themselves, and societies which do not view history in the same linear way where the past belongs to the past, they may find themselves more in common with Russia, not because of any specific policies necessarily, but because of this common vision, understanding, and perception that has them speaking a common language with Russia that they cannot find with the West. And this is a cultural issue that I don't think the West is quite equipped to address due to sheer lack of ethnographers and people involved in the process. They used to be there, but I don't know where they are now. But I certainly don't see that point being addressed anywhere. And what do you think about that?
I think broadly speaking, you're right. And what we can do certainly is, because, you know, it's you're always painting with a broad brush, especially when you're talking in a short interview and trying to sort of categorize societies into one type of society or another and say all Russians believe this. Well, you know, of course, Russia is a huge society with lots of different beliefs, and there is lots of complexity there. But I think the real promise for me lies in our ability to scrape data from the internet about the ways in which people are talking about the world, about the kinds of identities they're constructing for themselves, or that states are pushing, or other sort of nefarious actors of various sorts of pushing. We can see what's effective. We can see where people move from pro-Western towards anti-Western views. This is what Russia gets. They know how to push the triggers, push the buttons, and to appeal to these sorts of different places, different societies within places, different, even small groups within countries. And that's what they've done so effectively in the States, for example, by sowing discord and sowing discontent. We should be doing the same thing back. We should be reaching out to countries around the world on this cultural level and finding ways to say, well, look, you may consider that NATO is bad, quote unquote, but here are some of the good things that NATO could do. Here are some of the ways that that could actually play into your conception of the world, and in which NATO, for example, or it could be the American government, the British government, the Canadian government, whatever it is, an NGO from abroad. Here are some of the ways that they can actually tick the same kind of value boxes for you, support the things you want, without you thinking that NATO is invading you or somehow threatening your ability to uphold your own community values.
Now, speaking of community values, I kind of want to go back to your earlier point about Stalingrad as this unifying battle that brought together all these different people who with a unity of purpose that was very, very positive in a way, and that helped create this miraculous happenstance. What from your study of the subject, what contributed to that particular unity of purpose, other than, you know, necessity to survive, and how can we separate that this triumph of the human spirit from the effort by the Soviet state, which was complicit in making the conditions, forcing this horrible situation on people, from hijacking that narrative for their own, to justify their own ends? How can we make people still retain this pride in the ability to overcome hardship, but without letting state propaganda drive it in a very destructive direction?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question, because we have a ready-made novel of exactly how at least one of the people that were involved in creating this myth attempted to blow the myth apart by themselves. And that's the figure of Vasily Grossman, who was a Jewish Ukrainian writer who was actually at Stalingrad and was one of the 2 or 3 leading correspondents. He went and wrote fiction from the front, beautiful, amazing fiction, but ultimately Soviet propaganda, and propaganda that was used by the regime to justify the errors they made, to justify the repressions that happened towards the end of the war and, of course, after the war. And Grossman came to regret this very greatly. And he wrote this novel throughout the 1950s called Life and Fate. And if you haven't read Life and Fate, you absolutely should. It's a long novel, but I promise you it is, I think it's the best work of fiction of the 20th century. It's beautifully written, as well as being philosophically sound and historically fascinating. And Grossman says that really the issue in Life and Fate is that the way that the propaganda is constructed is by taking phrases, taking lines, and repeating them and repeating them and repeating them, so that that is the only language that anybody has to talk about an event like Stalingrad. To talk about being a Russian means to talk about Stalingrad and Stalin and necessary death and violence. And he says, well, that is totalitarian. It's just like what happened, what the Nazis did on the other side. They were doing the same thing, so I won't go into it now. And what Grossman says is, you need to forget those stories. You need to close the door on those stories. You need to write in a way that's polyphonic, that includes multiple voices, lots of different experiences, the experiences of Jews. He didn't talk about homosexuals because it would have been impossible at the time, and who knows how he thought about them. But he essentially has this slightly more liberal, open understanding of the way that you can talk about history and the past, and indeed the present. Now, Grossman got in an absolute load of hot water for this. The book was never published until the 1980s in the Soviet Union, I think 1988, 1989. He died a few years after completing it. He was basically persona non grata. It was, one of his friends called it was Grossman's suicide. So he knew what he was doing when he wrote this. And I think it's such a good model for understanding what we could do with Russia and with any other sort of other of these sticky mythical stories today. And that is to write the people that were actually there, to write different perspectives back into the story. And so, for example, if you take Russia in a much broader context today, well, Russian children are taught to be a good Russian citizen. You have to be orthodox, you have to be masculine, you have to be violent. If you're a woman, you have to be a good mother, these very traditional values. And they're shown role models and examples from Russian history. Tchaikovsky, the composer, is a good example. Here is a perfect Russian composer who wrote the 1812 symphony to celebrate military victory. Well, what could we do in return to sort of make this story of Tchaikovsky, this great Russian hero, polyphonic? Well, we could talk about the fact that he was homosexual, right? He was undoubtedly a queer man. And of course, you simply could not say that in Russia today. It would literally be illegal to talk about that in Russia today. But ultimately, we have to show the young Russians and the Russian public at large that, this was a great Russian. He was a great composer. He was even probably, potentially, possibly a nationalist, writing these great symphonies of the Russian history, these ballets and operas. But also he was a homosexual. Therefore, couldn't we find a way to include those sorts of people and those sorts of stories in Russia's self-understanding more broadly? And then you could do it again with ethnic minorities. You can do it again with people who maybe fought at Stalingrad but were repressed after Stalingrad and sent to the Gulag, and that did happen to some of them. You see, and you could start to build out this sort of multiplicity of worlds and of stories. It's hard work, but it's not that hard. This is not rocket science to do it. And we have the data, we have the tools to be able to figure out which stories might be successful. And we have the means to reach into Russia's social media space even and influence Russians today. So why aren't we doing it?
And that's actually brings me to a somewhat controversial point, which is that actually our tendency is to go in the opposite direction and to simplify our own narratives rather than to complicate and embody in the other side's narratives. Our own narratives are now becoming very black and white, us versus them, and very dehumanizing to the various groups. For some reason, to be critical of an idea or policy, you now have to also be attacking the people behind it. So it's become impossible to separate bad ideas from people who are proposing those ideas. And I think that's exactly why Russia is much more successful than we are in terms of pushing its own structure, if not vision, to the West, and we are less successful in transporting our own complicated stories and models into the Russian sphere. If we are already trending in the opposite direction, in large part thanks to the infiltration of various soft power institutions going back to the Soviet Union, then of course we're going to be less, as we are chasing inclusion and inclusivity, we are becoming less inclusive and actually more echo chamberish in our approach.
I think certainly when we talk about the way that we can reach out to Russians, or indeed anyone who opposes a particular narrative, the name of the West has been so tarred in Russia today that when we simply say, you know, to take World War II, if we were to simply send in a team of Western educated historians and we could produce the world's most beautiful, sparkling, brilliantly engaging documentary that would say, well, actually, here's the truth of what really happened, you will get this knee-jerk reaction. And this is well studied by experts in, for example, post-cult kind of psychology. You get a knee-jerk reaction simply saying, well, screw you, you're from the West, that's just a lie. I equally don't believe it. And therefore, I think you're right. The way that we need to do it is not necessarily simply by deconstructing and attacking others. It's by complicating and by adding in voices, adding in possibilities. And the more we do it, the more we undermine the Russian state's ability. And they do this not just with us, but also at home, of creating constant dividing lines between the good and the Russian, and the outside world and the bad. And anything on the outside of this very narrow box of what it can mean to be a good Russian today is inherently synonymously bad and threatens to destroy Russia.
One of the myths of victory is that you have to preserve the dignity and identity of the conquered party, or else you will end up like the Nazi Germany. But the problem is that that story that the World War I outcomes humiliated Germans, and that's what brought Hitler to power, is not true. But unfortunately, right now, a lot of the talking points in the West revolve around this idea. Well, you know, Russians are rising up because they are humiliated. China is rising up because it's been humiliated by the West. But, you know, even if it were the case, humiliation doesn't have to result in militancy. It can result in a shift of a mindset towards becoming an economic beneficiary and a partner to other countries, instead of, you know, and just doing better and setting a better example. Instead, we are seeing this mythology recreate myths and actually prevent the deconstruction of the negative that does need to be deconstructed. How do we overcome that challenge? Because Stalingrad was one of those things that actually helps prevent looking at some of the things that needed to be destroyed and aspects of their identity that needed to be unveiled.
So I think you're right that the humiliation aspect is a bit of a red herring in many ways. But the key for me is that if you, whatever it means, if you humiliate Russia in defeat, right? Let's say we spectacularly destroy Russia and everything falls apart. They go back to 1998, where, you know, they really are at a sort of economic and cultural low. They consider themselves back then the losers of history, the losers of the breakup of the Soviet Union. Maybe they return to that space in the next few years. We just don't know. Let's assume it's plausible. What the key is to avoid that error of the 1990s of simply ignoring that, and instead to say, right, let's use that space of destruction in order to start recreating. And we can start laying the groundwork now. That is what's so important. Don't leave this until everything has fallen apart, because then you also leave the door open for all sorts of other actors to come in and spread the narratives that they want. We can be reaching into that space starting now and laying the groundwork, making the alternatives more popular, making them more well-known, and saying, for example, with a story like Stalingrad or the World War II in general, you're probably familiar with the Immortal Regiment. Irini, you certainly will be, but others might not be. The Immortal Regiment is this sort of yearly parade that happens on Victory Day on May the 9th, where Russians go out in the streets holding images of their grandparents from World War II. They dress up in costumes. And this was actually founded as a grassroots grassroots movement back in 2015 by 3 journalists from Tomsk, which is the middle of nowhere in Russia. And I know one of the founders fairly well, and I've had many conversations with him about the motivations they had when they were founding it. And Sergei, this guy, tells me that really, really genuinely what we wanted to do back then was just remember. We just wanted to say, well, you know, the older generation is slipping away. They did make a huge sacrifice for us. Therefore, all we want to do is say, well, these, you know, not forget them, in the same way that any society would go out and try and remember its grandparents. And we remember the veterans of World War II and the veterans of even World War I in the West. The state came in and took over this movement and turned it into something much more deleterious, I would say. But there's a good example of what we can do. There's a good example of an event that had genuine grassroots appeal in Russia, that if the influence of the state was stripped out, there's nothing really wrong with Russians remembering the past, especially when it's on this individual familial level, when it's not attached to these narratives of grand sacrifice, of civilizational conflict, of saving the world, of the world owes Russia for its sacrifice. Instead, it's simply saying, I remember grandfather Yura, here's his photograph, here's what he did. And that's the end of it. Then at the end of May the 9th, the parade ends, we pack up the stuff and we all go home and we get on with that mentality.
You froze up for a second there. There we go. Well, that actually brings me to the next part of the conversation, which is the transition from Stalingrad to Generation Z, and that's quite, you know, that's quite a jump in historical timeline. Why did you decide to write about specifically this new generation right after the previously historical book? Oh, you're freezing up again.
How's that?
Okay, now better. I was just transitioning from Stalingrad to Generation Z, and was asking you what inspired you to that particular subject after Stalingrad.
Perfect. So the Generation Z work came, and I was sort of fishing around in this area before February the 24th and thinking of writing a book, something along these lines, but I wanted to speed up the work and get it done as a result of the war. And I'm really interested in how the state is bringing up a new generation and inculcating these stories of sacrifice, of death, the values of the idea that you have to be a certain very limited kind of Russian, using social media, using pop culture, using schools, and using much more frightening youth groups like the Youth Army, where they're teaching real military skills alongside these stories and much more sort of abstract concepts. And so I went out and I talked to dozens of young people and people who work with young people in Russia today, and started putting together this story of what it is like to be deep in the heart of this world in which the genocide of Ukrainians, the murder of Ukrainians, is somehow saving Russia's next generation.
A lot has been said about how young Russians are different from their predecessors because they are westernized, they've traveled to the West, they've studied here, they've had access to the internet, they grew up better off financially, and they're not into the sacrificial rhetoric. Even if they listen to it in schools, they have their, you know, iPhones, their pop culture, their little luxuries in life, and they don't want to give it up. How true is that in your experience? And if it's not as true as people think it is, why is that?
So when you look at the millennial generation, the generation that came of age before 2012, 2013, 2014, when Putin became increasingly ideological, increasingly paranoid about the outside world, and then, of course, invaded Crimea and, in answer to your question, wrecked the Russian economy in doing so, well, those millennials are not very happy about what's happening, right? Even if they're okay with the idea that Russia is a great power, that, they're still quite attached to these imperialist ideas, they know what they've lost, right? They understand that because they were connected to the outside world. But when you look at Russians who are much younger, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, they're growing up in a world in which they don't see that at all. Travel abroad has become much harder, not just in the last year, but simply because of the state of the Russian economy. As a middle-class person, it was much harder to go abroad because you simply didn't have the money as the ruble collapsed in value. Educational opportunities abroad were shrinking. The state was producing this more and more ideologized school curriculum. And crucially, the state is in those social media groups. It's in your smartphones, creating really slick and savvy marketing campaigns that are designed to make children feel like the other kids are joining the state. The other kids are this kind of Russian. The other kids are not queer. The other kids are not ethnic minority. And if they are fighting a battle within themselves to try and turn themselves into better Russians, i.e. become more white ethnic Russian, to become more straight, more masculine, and indeed more violent, whether that's in terms of the language that they use online, or whether it's by signing up for the army, potentially, or by signing up for a youth group and learning to fight.
This racial and kind of ethnocentric element is nothing new to the last decade. We can actually see before even the invasion of Georgia in 2008, the racist rhetoric against the workers from Central Asia who were coming in, and the cultivation of neo-Nazi groups that received some coverage in the West, but because Russia was not considered a superpower, no one really cared about that. So there's been a gradual cultivation of those ideas that became more mainstreamed. And another issue that hasn't really broken the news at the time it happened was the religious element of school curriculum, which is the introduction of Orthodox Christianity, or at least the Russian state version of it, into official public school curriculum, which did not bring any concerns in the West, and in fact might have been even welcomed by a few people. So this role of ethnic discourse, religious discourse, and this sort of shaping of an exclusivist identity in Russian culture, that's been going on for a while. And this failure to stand up to these early signs, I don't think we've quite realized that this is not something that was just made up for the Ukraine invasion today, that it's been building up. How do we confront a reality when we can't even get ourselves to admit that it is, in fact, what's actually going on?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right that we can look back to Putin's first weeks in power and listen to the things that he was saying, which is that it is justifiable to go to Chechnya and kill people violently, that this is somehow making the Russian state whole again. This is a language of neo-fascism. And of course, at the same time, when he spoke to the West, he was using the language of liberal democracy quite strategically. He's always been a clever rhetorical player in that regard. When we look back to the 2000s, we can see, you're right, the state cultivating far-right groups, neo-Nazi groups, using them, but just on the edges of Russian mainstream culture, right? Using them to oppress, to keep violence around, always present. But what's really changed more recently over the last 5 to 10 years is the fact that that kind of culture has become mainstream in Russia, that is what the state pushes on state television constantly. You might be 1 minute watching, The Voice, the reality show. There's a Russian version. It's terrifically popular, which seems pretty ideology free. And then this much more dangerous material just slips onto your screen. And before you know it, you are watching Solovyov and his propagandists talk about hail these violent heroes and denigrate Ukrainians and indeed the whole of the West, anybody who doesn't fit into this Russian religious ideal, as being evil and, their words, satanic.
Now it's become very popular around the world, not just in the West, to open doors for young people to transition to greater political engagement by forming all sorts of liaison groups and youth groups and international UN delegation groups and so forth. To what extent has Russia utilized this strategy, and how has its use or lack thereof shaped the role of the young people and with respect to the state and their function?
Yeah, this isn't a new idea for Russia today, and you can look back to the Soviet era when the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League, was your ticket to party membership, good university places, and ultimately a good and comfortable life, or at least a better life than you might otherwise have enjoyed. But ever since the early 2000s, the state has been running youth groups that they've been using to deploy symbolically on key occasions, makes the great PR, young people wearing Putin t-shirts, waving flags, luring people into those groups, promising them great careers. And many of the people that were involved in the early groups are in power today. And we're seeing a proliferation in recent years of more of these sorts of groups attached to more violent ideologies, more determined to spread the narrative of things like World War II, but also receiving greater support from the state than they ever have done before. And these groups are getting quite big. The Youth Army, the paramilitary youth group for kids that I mentioned, now has something like 1.25 million members, and the state wants to have every fifth Russian school child enrolled in, I think, the next 3 or 4 years. So these are not insignificant movements. This is not fringe stuff that only a handful of people out in the provinces are joining. This is a large section of the younger generation are being influenced in this way.
And how are they being recruited exactly? Why would something like that be appealing to any family? What's offered in exchange?
So certainly there is just that pragmatic benefit of paths into university, paths into better army careers than just being a sort of cannon fodder on the front. Paths into the civil service, of course. There is some pressure from the state. They came under criticism a few years ago for having pushed orphaned children, the children of alcoholic parents, of homeless parents, of drug addict parents, into joining this sort of group, promising that the state would be a better parent. But also, in recent years, the state's use of social media has been such that children see other children joining, see other children in fun TikTok videos where they're doing ordinary day-to-day youth army, for example, activities. And children see other children and want to belong. And when I spoke to some of the parents of these children, the parents are pretty uninterested, to be honest. You know, they're the millennials, the older millennials, of course. They're just like, well, you know, I don't hate Putin, don't love him, not very interested, leave me alone. But their kids, some of them at least, are much more hyped up about this stuff. And of course, they may not say, I'm a Putinist, I want to go out and destroy Ukraine. But what they do say is, I want to be like my friends. What are my friends doing? Well, they're joining the youth group. And that's where, over time, this education and this ideological program might begin to have a much more dangerous effect than we anticipate.
Now, it's very interesting to look at the dynamic and the continuity of this program, despite the obvious, yes, just this last question, and then despite the obvious military lack of success in Ukraine and, quite frankly, stagnation elsewhere around the world, with the exception of Wagner and its looting in Africa and things of that nature. What does that tell you about the continuity of this program, despite the fact that Ukraine is likely going to be a disaster for Russia, at best a long-term stalemate, and and more likely a loss? What are they going to do with these young people, given that this big campaign where Russia pulled all of its resources is not having the intended military impact and economic impact?
the playbook will be the same as it's always been under Putin. And that is find somebody to blame for the failures of the regime to do what it can promise. And it's always promised fairy tales. It's always promised utopias. And I don't think many people recognize the utopian language that the Putin regime was using even in the early 2000s when it was supposedly trying to integrate with the West. And so as the dream fails, every single time the promise is, well, we will just fight one more battle. If we can just destroy this, if we can just destroy that, somehow Russia will be free of whatever is dragging us down.
So to the people who believe that a peace deal with Russia at this time will solve all ills, clearly the presence of these youths that are being weaponized, regardless whether Russia succeeds or fails, indicates that Russia has no intention of limiting its ideology to any particular battle, but it has a much broader vision than any specific confrontation, and compromising with it is not going to put an end to all of this. A lesson to be drawn from history as well as to contemporary analysis. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Garner. For everyone watching this, I hope you check out both of these books and read them when Generation Z also comes out. And I hope we will continue this conversation and that everyone who needs to listen draws appropriate conclusions. This was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio with Irina Zuckerman. And thank you for joining us tonight. Please join us next week, Tuesday night, 9 p.m.